we have two more speakers now. They are both from TERI, and Vasudha Singh, who is a research associate in the Center for Global Environmental Research. She works in the area of, primarily on the area of adaptation. She has experience of handling issues relating to adaptation, migration, gender, and all other related aspects. So she will speak to you about from that angle.
Thank you, sir. It is indeed a great privilege and an absolute delight to be present here and to be presenting this to you, the work that we've been doing and our engagement with DSTE and the UT of Puducherry in the last 2 years. But I will be keeping my presentation very brief at the cost of not repeating and also saving time. So why do states need their own action plan? First, there are different vulnerabilities and exposure in each state which lead to different impacts. Now, developing the state action plan on climate change is actually a proactive stance from the Government of India in decentralizing the efforts toward climate change actions. These are basically instruments for the states and the union territories to identify their vulnerabilities to climate change and work towards addressing these in a coherent manner. Now, the UT of Puducherry had first submitted its SAPCC in the year 2013. In 2018, the MOEFCC directed all states and union territories to revise their action plan on climate change. This was in the backdrop of the evolving context on climate science, policy and actions, India's nationally determined contributions, and given the fact that the scientific and economic understanding and knowledge on climate change has advanced in the last few years, so one has to take advantage of that. And there are dedicated centers, departments that have worked on climate change projections and models, so we have better knowledge available, and therefore we have to evolve with the time and then evolve with the evolving knowledge. And also, there are lessons learned from the first set of SAPCC. When we first started out, there was a lack of clarity on actionable points. There were no clear objectives. And in terms of how do you plan, whether it's the short term or the medium term or the long term, the clarity was not there in the first run of the SAPCC. And so in terms of financial resources as well, there was inadequate appropriation or allocation of financial resources. So now that we are in a better state, we have learned from our experiences, the revision of SAPCC is taking place. So just to take you quickly through the framework for the revision of the state action plans, this is something that is being guided by the MOEFCC. So in the state action plans, you're supposed to have, there are 9 sections, so introduction, state profile, climate profile, vulnerability assessment is a key component. Then we come to the climate change strategies on mitigation and then on adaptation. And there's a section on financing the SAPCC, followed by institutional mechanisms and monitoring and evaluation. Now, because we are talking about integrating climate action in the development planning and policies, it's important to understand that development as usual without the consideration of climate risks and opportunities will not allow us to face the growing challenges of the changing climate. So if there are a lot of projects that do cater to or contribute to developing resilience, but if you So, for example, if you're having a coastal zone management plan, and if you're not taking into account the long-term impacts of, say, sea level rise, therefore, it could lead to maladaptation and basically increase the vulnerabilities. So, therefore, it is important to include all these risks associated with the long-term climate change impacts, and they have to be systematically considered in the development planning at all levels. And particular attention is also to be paid to the policies and projects with long-term consequences, like I mentioned. And building in timely climate change adaptation measures will greatly enhance the benefits and sustainability of many development initiatives. Yeah. So at the local level, it is important for mainstreaming climate change adaptation, because here we're talking about subnational action. So this is basically for 3 reasons. First, so climate change impacts are manifested locally. And they affect the local livelihoods, activities, economic enterprises, health risks, etc. Secondly, vulnerability and adaptive capacity are determined by local conditions. So the kind of projections or projections we would have at the national scale would not cover the dramatic changes or the dramatic differences that exist at the local level. And thirdly, adaptation activities are often best observed at the local level. So whether it is your decision making or whether how you are doing the monitoring and evaluation per se, if that is monitored at the local levels and you see how the funds that you're putting into these activities are contributing and what the kind of impacts that they're bringing out, these are best understood at the local level. So we basically have these sectors. The sectors in focus for adaptation include water, agriculture, tourism, health, disaster management, fisheries and coastal resources, animal husbandry, forest and wildlife. So basically, if we look at the guidelines for designing these interventions, I would just like to mention that these are the initiatives and the strategies that reflect the commitment of the UT and the proposed actions to tackle the vulnerabilities and impacts and across the socio-economic sectors. The interventions that have been designed, they are synergized with the goals of the NDCs and the linkages to the Sustainable Development Goals as well. They're further aligned with the 8 national missions. So National Solar Mission, Mission on Enhanced Energy Efficiency, Sustainable Habitat, Sustainable Agriculture and Green India Mission, Water Mission, Strategic Knowledge Mission, and particularly in the case of Puducherry, this is a new addition, which was the Coastal Resources and Disaster Management. Now, when we design the interventions, we have clearly defined targets and time period of implementation, whether they are to be implemented in the short term, the medium term, or the long term, and the time frame that we're looking at is between 2021 and 2030. Further, for each of the interventions and the activities designed, whether it is for adaptation or mitigation, the institutional mechanism is very clearly laid out in terms of who will be the nodal agencies and the associated agencies that will be implementing the said activities or interventions, who are the stakeholders, and stakeholder engagement is a very crucial component, and several speakers before me have emphasized enough on this aspect. Thirdly, capacity building, and finally monitoring and evaluation, something that we have already talked about at great length. And basically when we have designed the interventions and the activities, associated indicators have also been mentioned, and this is again, deciding the indicators is also a consultative process where you involve all the stakeholders and arrive at a specific indicator. So because time, I'm just going to talk about the water sector, and the key issues that the water sector in Puducherry is facing is basically the depleting quantity and quality of groundwater, surface water sources and siltation, and seasonal flooding. So groundwater, so we know that groundwater draft is pretty high, groundwater development is very high in Puducherry, and due to the sea level rise and also intrusion of saline water, it is a major thrust area. Like a lot of our interventions and activities are trying to cater to this particular issue. So some of the interventions, I'll quickly mention those. See, promotion of conjunctive use of ground and surface water to reduce the dependence on groundwater. So one of the projects that we have mentioned just quite a few minutes before was the NACC project on the integrated surface water management, where you're rejuvenating tanks and ponds in Karaikal and Puducherry. So that is one aspect that is linked with this particular intervention. The management of bore wells, effective community mobilization and participation through a well-charted information, education and communication plan. So this is basically to mobilize community participation. As we know that it's just not the government's job or the line department's job, it has to have a collective effort from the citizens, from people from all walks of life. Then revamping water supply infrastructure. So the smart cities, the smart cities mission has already outlined certain projects and activities which can be integrated towards the adaptation activities and the existing functions of the line departments. The stormwater management, then the strengthening of public health infrastructure and ensuring clean water and sanitation. So specific activities within this intervention are already outlined. Some of these activities have been taking place in the last 5 to 7 years, and there is further scope for scaling them and strengthening institution capacities. These are some of the adaptation interventions. I would just like to end on, since we're talking about adaptation in this particular presentation, simply speaking, adapting to climate change means taking action to prepare for and adjust to both the current effects of climate change and the predicted impacts of climate change. So, when we take the criteria of urgency, cost, political will, and social acceptance, these can all help prioritize adaptation options. If you're speaking about Puducherry, flood preparedness measures, improvement of drainage systems, coastal management, conservation of mangroves, these are all important key areas which can be worked upon. And about adaptation itself, it is a learning process, and adaptation activities need to be continuously improved. So whether this is this revision exercise or the ones that will come later on, we have to realize that this is something that has to continuously evolve and change and develop. And like we are all sitting here today, we have to involve decision makers. The understanding about climate change has to be increased, and more awareness has to be created amongst the society and community so that the objectives can be met effectively. So I will end here. Of course, we will be taking questions perhaps later on. Thank you.
Very focused. She has told you about what exactly adaptation is about and how do we need to approach the entire business of preparing the state action plan on climate change. That work is in progress. With the help of the government of Puducherry, we are working in different areas. The structure which she showed to you about how the action plan will be prepared, and that will include two important areas of intervention. One was adaptation, the second is mitigation. So she talked to you about the possible intervention in the areas of adaptation, which will have to be prioritized by the state government, the UT government, and then you have to implement those actions and measure the progress. The next speaker, who is another colleague of ours, Ms. C.P. Veena, will talk to you about the mitigation part of the action plan. And what are the possible interventions which are relevant for Puducherry and other states. C.P. Veena is working in the RO Center on Global Environmental Research, and she has been associated with several areas of mitigation, inventory, preparation, MRV, transparency, and things like that. So she is in a good position to tell you about what mitigation should look like for UT of Puducherry.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really grateful to be part of this workshop, and I thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to present on specifically on the mitigation perspective of the SAPCC. So my presentation will be focused on two parts. First is the GHG profile of the UT, and second is the mitigation interventions that are aligned with the GHG sector. So coming on to the, just giving a brief introduction. So just by looking at the objective of climate change from a global perspective, it is basically to achieve or stabilize greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere that will help in preventing the dangerous and anthropogenic interference with climate system. That is to kind of control of the global warming that has been affecting our atmosphere. So what is the approach to stabilize this greenhouse gas concentration? The best way is to estimate the level of greenhouse gas emissions that is being emitted and how much has been removed through carbon sinks. And the best method that can be used is through a GHG inventory, which is a list of emission sources that helps to estimate the total greenhouse gas that has been emitted. And usually we have a standard method that is the IPCC National Greenhouse Gas Inventory that is being used in order to calculate the greenhouse gas emission. So coming on to the GHG emission profile of Puducherry, which has been developed for the SAPCC. In order to develop the GHG inventory, the process was carried out in reference with the 2006 IPCC guidelines for national gas inventories. We actually adopted the tier 1 approach, where we used default emission factors for various activity data. So the basic equation that we used is the activity data multiplied by the emission factor. So coming on to the sectors that are relevant to the UT are energy, AFLU and waste. So under energy there are different subsectors which are electricity, transport, residential and industrial. For AFLU is agriculture, forest and other land use. So the relevant subsectors that were identified for the UT were enteric fermentation, which is the emission from livestock, manure management and rice cultivation. Coming on to the waste, it was basically pertaining to the municipal solid waste. So after the calculation, it was observed that in terms of sectoral emission contribution, that is we calculated this for the period of 2014 to 2019. So it was observed that most of the emission, that is greenhouse gas emissions, were from the energy sectors, that is contributed to almost 75%. The second most contributing sector was AFLU with 22.3%, and that's the third largest emitting sector was the waste with almost 2% of GHG emissions. So coming on to the energy sector, this can be kind of perceived in two areas. First is in terms of electricity generation and electricity consumption. So Puducherry has one gas-based power plant. So in terms of that, if we see the energy, so through the electric consumption, it was observed that almost 1.1 lakh tons of CO2 was produced within the period of 2014 to 2019 in terms of electricity generation. When it comes to the electricity consumption, transport sector was the maximum, emitted the maximum amount of GHG emissions. This is basically due to the high density vehicle population in UT, also due to the rapid growth in vehicle ownership and tourism needs. The second largest contributor in terms of electricity consumption was the household sector with an average of 1.3 lakh tons of CO2 being emitted. This is basically due to the increasing consumption of LPG for cooking. And the last sector, third largest contribution was the industry sector with an average estimated emission of about 1 lakh tons of CO2 per year. So this was in terms of electricity consumption, that is consumption of fossil fuels. So if we see the energy sector, this was the subsectoral emission contribution percentage between 2014 to 2019. So the highest contribution was by transport, followed by residential, and then industry and electricity generation. Next sector is the AFLU, that is agriculture, forest and other land use. So overall, during the period of 2014 to 2019, it was seen that the average emission from the sector was 1.75 million tons of CO2. And coming on to the subcategories, the highest was rice cultivation in terms of methane emission, or in terms of carbon equivalent. It can be seen that the average GHG emission was 1.4 lakh. And in terms of livestock, that is together enteric and manure management, it was 1.37 lakh tons of year. Next is the waste sector. So waste sector was the least contributing sector of the UT. This contributed to almost 2% of the total emissions, and in terms of annually, it overall estimation was 23,000, and this we considered only the municipal solid waste for the UT. So the next part will be more on the mitigation aspects. These mitigation strategies that I will be discussing was more aligned to the GHG sector emissions, also in align with the national missions and SDGs and NDCs. So just to give a background why mitigation is important, we can see that Puducherry is a very rapidly urbanizing and developing UT. So the challenge will be to ensure growth of economy, infrastructure and industrial production while reducing the GHG emissions. So in order to focus on this, it is very much important to have a robust framework of strategies and interventions that will help in terms of reducing the GHG emissions. So during our consultation, we could identify several interventions in terms of short, medium and long term for lowering the emission from carbon intensive sectors. The focus of these sectors were mainly on 4 aspects, that is renewable energy, energy efficiency, transport and waste. And these were aligned with the national missions of enhanced energy efficiency, solar and sustainable habitat mission. So coming to the renewable energy, already the government of Puducherry has formulated a solar power policy in 2015, and Puducherry has a high potential of kind of enhancing the rooftop solar or solar PV in the sector. So the interventions mainly identified through the stakeholder consultations were a deployment of solar rooftop system, solar PV, installation of solar lights, and also increase the renewable based energy generation through power purchase. So the next sector will be more on energy and efficiency. So Puducherry has a limited power generation capacity. It has only one gas-based power plant. So the remaining power demand is met from other neighboring states. So in order to have a more resourceful use of energy consumption, there are several interventions that are related to energy efficiency, that is implementing energy efficient appliances and technologies in several government and public institutions as well as in urban areas, and also enhancing and implementing ECBC guidelines in buildings, including government, public or commercial aspects. Also introducing perform, achieve and trade scheme, and installing LEDs at street lights in smart cities. These are the few interventions that were identified for Puducherry. So the next sector is transport. Transport, as we discussed, is the highest emitting sector. This is basically due to the high density population and also vehicular ownership is very much high, and also there has been cities visited by many local, national, global tourists all around. So this has been a big constraint in terms of transport. So the interventions are basically the promotion of public transport. That has been a big gap in the UT. So first is the promotion of public transport, deploying more buses or local taxis for the citizen to kind of travel within the boundaries. Also the promotion of EV vehicles, e-rickshaws and EV charging stations will be another huge potential where we can reduce the GHG emission in terms of transport sector. Also installing ITS, that is intelligent transport system, which helps to kind of control the traffic flow, is another intervention. And more green, I would say more green intervention will be the developing pedestrian and cyclist pathways. So coming on to the last sector, that is waste. Already the Puducherry has adopted different methods in terms of waste management, and Puducherry kind of holds the rank of 171 in Swachh Saraksha 2020 rankings. So the interventions related to waste is setting up the waste to energy plant, which is in process. Feasibility study has been happening in Puducherry. Next is initiation and completion of bio-mining plant. And another big intervention is the integrated waste management plan for handling and processing waste, which is a 15-year-old contract with private companies, which will help in processing, storage, and converting the waste to energy. This will include all the interventions as mentioned. And in terms of livestock, it's more on the setting up of modern slaughterhouse, which will be using a more efficient ways of efficient way of using a slaughterhouse. So, lastly, I would like to conclude by saying that, as mentioned, Puducherry is a rapidly urbanizing and developing UT. So this comes up with different challenges. Therefore, we need a more robust and more planned policy action, which will help in kind of moving towards a more sustainable manner. Also, the best practice to follow will be the comprehensive development plan of Puducherry, which entails all the sectors. With this, I would like to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Focused in her presentation, and she outlined the possible areas of intervention, and I am sure a number of them may be quite interesting to you, and you will have some specific questions on this. Lastly, she ended on a very important remark, saying that it is not enough to prepare only a state action plan. For the government, it is also important to prepare a long-term developmental plan which is climate resilient. Climate change action plan is only about climate, but developmental process is much larger. But in future, since we are facing this grave problem, each sector needs to grow in a climate friendly manner. So for that, you have to have a much larger policy goal, and it will be important for the state government to prepare a long-term plan for growth which will meet the requirements of climate. Transport, agriculture, water, forest, or any other sector which you can think of has to have its own sectoral plan. That is very important. Not just measuring the impacts of climate change and addressing them, but to prepare yourself next 50 years down the line to become net zero, carbon neutral, and climate friendly development. So I'm sure with these presentations you will have a number of questions in your mind. If the organizers permit me, I can still ask the panelists, the presenters, to respond to those questions. If you can pass a microphone around. So let me ask if you have any questions. It's open house now. If you have any questions, please raise your hands. I'll ask the presenter to answer that.
First of all, I thank you all for giving such a wonderful presentation. It was quite relevant for us. Let me introduce myself. I am Jawahar. I recently joined in Government of Puducherry. A week back, I was working for Government of Mizoram. But drawing from the experience of working in Pondicherry in the past, I would like to ask how reflective this scenario, what you have projected for the whole of UT of Puducherry, because Pondicherry, as you know, is scattered across 3 different states, and the regional climatic conditions are quite different. I mean, when you take Mahe, for instance, it is abutting Arabian Sea, and in that sense, it has a slightly different climatic conditions compared to place like Puducherry and Karaikal. Yanam, of course, is also.
So what is the question?
The question is, how reflective is the scenario which is projected for Puducherry?
Okay.
And whether it is largely the case of Puducherry, or you are talking for Mahe and Yanam as well.
Okay. Saurabh, would you like to? Saurabh is not here. So I think I will wait for him to join us back. In the meantime, if there are any other questions, I think the gentleman wanted to ask a question. Okay, that was the one. Okay.
To reduce the greenhouse gases. Have you calculated those metrics for all the different interventions?
Dr. Reddy, if you bear with us, first question will be answered by Suruchi.
Yeah. So the scenarios are basically the global scenarios, and what we are doing is, like I mentioned, as per these two scenarios, how the world is changing in the future, and with that future warming, what does it mean at a local level to our Puducherry, all the 4 regions, how much of warming they will see in these two scenarios, as the world will warm, say 1.5 to 2.5, what does it mean locally for us? That is what it means.
Okay. Dr. Reddy, to answer that question, let me, on behalf of Veena, the interventions which have been presented in the action plan for mitigation purposes, those are indicators of reference for drafting the state action plan is to indicate the possible sectoral interventions. I don't think they have gone into the issue of what impact it will actually have and how it will affect the inventory, final inventory of emissions within a certain period of time. So that is a separate exercise altogether, which I think we will need to carry out. But at this stage, they are indicative. It's, the last question maybe.
Global average temperature has been fixed as 15 degrees. How it is worked out, sir? 15 degree, how the figure is arranged?
Any one of you? Yeah.
So basically, there's a very important question that has been raised, that the global average temperature, they say, is around 15 to 18 degrees centigrade. How it is worked out? So the idea is, when we talk of greenhouse gases, they are very important to us. If there would not be any greenhouse gases, our planet would have been frozen and it would have been unlivable. So basically, greenhouse gases presents a warming around the planet of Earth, and we get a subsequent livable temperature of around 15 to 18 degrees. What is happening right now is enhanced greenhouse effect. Since there are more gases than the average should be, we are getting more warming. And how it is worked out? There are set of different observations around the world, both at land, both at sea, and there are averages that are taken over land and over sea. So you have surface air temperature, land air temperature, surface ocean temperature, as well as high level temperatures. So when we talk of global average, it is an average both over land and sea, but in IPCC reports you will also see ocean average temperature, land averages temperature separately also. So they are basically averages of daily temperatures taken from different WMO sites, World Meteorological Organizations. IMD is also a member of it. So many observations over India, Indian region, many observational stations are providing those observational values to WMO also, and then in turn WMO is basically providing and giving these kind of information to the entire world.
The inventory on the transportation sector, that is carbon equivalently, Madam was presenting, it suddenly from 2015 it has got reduced. Maybe impact of corona and all had come only after 19 and 20. But the when she presented, there was drastic that need to be checked.
Okay, I think you will need to keep this into account. Why there is a drop in the emissions from transport sector. So I think we have come to the end of this session, and thank you very much for being patient with us. It has been extremely interesting and enriching session where we have learnt about how the action plan is being prepared and what are the key areas which we should keep in mind and what kind of capacity we need to build up at the state level. So once again, let me thank all the presenters and all the audience and the government of Puducherry once again. Thank you.